I'm just going to do a bit of a notes getting up. We can edit this. But yes, Ricardo, you know how I said I wouldn't be doing a PowerPoint? Because I was writing my notes and I was like, I kind of want there to be like logical sections to this that
because
might guide people through.
like Aristotle's ideas are very well segmented, aren't they?
Well, yeah, but also it's just like, yeah, I need it to have some sort of. It's easier to remember stuff if it's like logically divided into sections.
Yeah.
And it's easier to logically divide things into sections if it's flashing in your face on the screen.
Yeah, exactly. That's
So
fine.
I'm going to stream my slides.
All right. Hold up. Let me see if I can change the scenes to that.
Sure,
we can just change into that. Screen capture. Okay. And then let's just put this application capture. And then set it to the display and then the screen. Okay. And let me just quickly get this. All right, it is.
Cool. Everything working?
Should be.
We can do a test. If you stop the recording and then check the file.
No, I think it is. Right. Just right. Let's hit it. Go.
Okay, so my presentation is called 2000-year-old advice. And it's sort of that gets at the heart of what we're going to be talking about, because it is stuff that's been written and was originally spoken more than 2000 years ago by a man who lived more than 2000 years ago and was familiar with the environment and things going on 2000 years ago. And the fact that we're even talking about it is a testament to how important it is, how influential it is, and how much it actually contributes to the realm of Western philosophical thought. Now, what is this 2000-year-old advice? Well, it was written by a man called Aristotle, and you've definitely heard of him because he is, if not the most famous, one of the most famous philosophers of all time. And in that vein, he was also one of the first, coming in at, number 2 or 3, give or take, which puts him at a considerable advantage at getting there first and coming up with some of the ideas before anyone else. But it's just our luck that he was very good at doing that, which is why his ideas have been so persistent. Now, he was tutored by Plato, who you may also have heard of, who was in his own right a very influential and very important philosopher in the realm of Western philosophy. And they both lived in ancient Greece, which was a great area for sort of fermenting philosophical thought, because previously in history, a lot of your time is preoccupied with getting food, fighting wars, and stealing women from neighboring cities. And the conditions that arose in Greece around this time actually enabled, in Athens as well specifically, enabled these philosophers to spend less of their time fighting and fucking and more of their time thinking. And that has enabled us to, them to contemplate some of the more intricate and broader themes of life and what it means to be living. And that essentially founded, what we now call philosophy and what they called philosophy. And now, so what were his aims? He's in the situation where he's given free rein to start thinking about things, and really a lot of it sort of came back to just understanding the world and reality, and the nature of things. Because when you're given free rein at that time period, especially, there's everything to understand. Because not much thinking had been written down to that point, so you've essentially got unlimited things to start trying to pin down and put into words. And so his sort of MO was to understand the natural world, and they called this science, to understand the science of rhetoric, the science of politics. All of these things came under the one umbrella of science, which was to understand the mechanisms of reality. Um, Now his effect was immediate, because he was very influential among his own circle. In fact, he was influential outside of his own circle as well, because he was one of a few people. He was the primary tutor of Alexander the Great. Now we'll get on to why that may not be as significant as it sounds, but it goes to show that a lot of people were thinking about the stuff he was saying, and a lot of people were hearing it, and that was pretty cool, given that a lot of people, for a lot of history just before this, weren't interested in hearing this sort of thing that he would like to talk about, that being philosophy. Now, obviously, he had an immediate effect, but more importantly, arguably, he had a long-lasting effect to the modern day. And there is a case to be made that a lot of, if not all, modern philosophy is founded upon his thinking, whether it's in opposition or agreement to what he was saying. And as a result, a lot of what I'm going to be talking about seems pretty self-evident, but at the time, it may not have been. And the fact that we can take such things for granted could be, entirely thanks to Aristotle and those he taught. Uh, Now, the next stage is the end. Now, what is the end? The end is that ultimate end to which we're all working, and it's one of the things Aristotle thought as being, the most important thing to think about. And in all of philosophy, it sort of is that. What is the aim of philosophy? Well, it's to work towards some sort of greater state of being, and some greater goal. And for Aristotle, this was an ultimate end. This was something that he saw as the end to which all means would eventually lead. And so, what do I mean by that? I mean that if you perform an action in your day to day life, it's always subordinate to another goal. So if you're taking the dog for a walk, that's the subordinate end for that is for your dog to be happy, and likewise a happy dog means that you're more happy, and you can always trace your actions to a greater end, and ultimately every action, so Aristotle said, could be traced to an ultimate end, that was the driving force behind everything everyone does. Now, is this something that's really meaningful in the modern day? Is this something that we can sort of practice and act upon? Well, that's something we'll come back to later. Which brings me on to the next idea. So obviously the ultimate end is something that's important. Now, what is it, and what did Aristotle think it was? Now, Aristotle would have called it eudaimonia. I'm calling it to be Felix, which is the sort of Roman or Latin for a similar term. And I like the Latin. It's Holly's pointed out to me that it's felicitas, to have felicitas, to be Felix, is sort of is both to be happy but also to be lucky. It's sort of to be good in more ways than you would just traditionally associate with the English of happiness, which is why I like the word. And so Aristotle's sort of ultimate end is comparable to later sort of hedonistic philosophies, that being happiness and well-being in yourself is the ultimate end, and virtue is a means to that end. And he talks a lot about virtue, and he's essentially written one of the first, if not the first, ever bits of virtue ethics around this idea of eudaimonia. Now, if the pursuit of the happiness is the ultimate end, then everything you should do should attempt to maximize that. My own personal take is slightly in opposition to that. I think happiness is in itself a means, and I would take issue with it being set as the ultimate ends. But I can see, why, when happiness means more to someone than just the word happy means to us, it comes as something that's more all encompassing and is very clearly to people who live in hardship the goal. So I can see how my perspective on that may be limited. Again, is this take on what the ultimate end is as being happiness? Is that something that's practicable in everyday life? Again, we'll come back to this. Now, this is another thing that Aristotle talks about, which is the idea that pleasure is a good thing, insofar as pleasure for achieving a virtuous ends, or having pleasure as facilitating virtue. Because obviously, if you take pleasure in harming other people, if you're some sort of conqueror who enjoys torturing the people he's subjugating, then obviously that's not virtuous. So Aristotle talks about, if you truly mean to be virtuous, you should take pleasure in virtuous actions. It shouldn't be hard for you to do something virtuous. It should come naturally. And he talks about how this can come with upbringing, but likewise, I would sort of impose my view that habit is a big part of this as well. If you habitually eat well and go out and walks and do runs, it may be hard at first, but eventually all of these things become pleasurable, especially through habit, but also just through the by virtue of understanding that they are contributing to a greater good. Now, is this practicable? Is this something that you can take away and say, well, I want to take pleasure in being virtuous? We're starting to get into, well, I would say so, yeah. I think if you can understand that something isn't sustainable, virtue isn't sustainable if it's painful, if doing the right thing hurts and is annoying, then you'll stop doing it given enough time. This brings us on to Plato's sort of meta philosophy, not metaphysics, but his philosophy on philosophy, his advice. So the things he would talk about that are relevant to how you practice philosophy, and his philosophy as well. And I think this is this is fundamentally practicable, and it's. I'm just trying to find in my notes where I talk about this. Yeah, so he says, this is my first quote for him, which is why I need to find it. We must not look for the same degree of exactness in all our studies, but only for as much as the subject matter in each case allows, and so far as is appropriate to the investigation. And with that, he's essentially saying, only spend as much time looking into something as that thing warrants. And that's advice, because he's giving you advice on how deeply to look into the philosophy and the science of certain things. So that could be the science of, making clothes, for example. If you're interested in tailoring and stuff, as an example, but that's only useful to you insofar as it allows you to crochet or knit a jumper. You're not going to it's not useful to you to look into leather working and all that. Just only pay attention to the things that are useful, because you've got limited time, you've got limited headspace for all these things, and if you really want to give the more important things the time and attention they need, you need to limit the amount of time you spend on the less important things. And this is the first example of something that's very practicable coming from him, where you can really put into practice something he's saying, where um, you know, a lot of the time I will find myself putting too much time and reading too many Wikipedia articles about something that ultimately doesn't really matter in any sense, whether that be, to my job or to my relationships and so on. Another example of his sort of meta philosophy is, beginning is more than half the whole task and throws a flood of light on many of the aspects of the inquiry. That's similar to the last thing I was saying, where, doing something halfway will give you more than half of the knowledge of that thing. So if you spend, 3 hours learning to skateboard, you'll learn an infinite more amount than someone who doesn't know how to skateboard, and you'll be halfway to the way of, knowing of someone who's spent days doing it. So there's it's sort of an exponential thing, and that's quite useful for understanding how to go about philosophy. Now the mean, this is something Aristotle talks about, and is extremely important to his philosophy, and having read Nicomachean Ethics, which is his original ethics. This is the thing that I've most resonated with, and the mean he talks about as an average, and it's an average in everything you do. You should seek to find the mean of every action you take and everything you do and everything you interact with. And this whole concept can be essentially summed up in the sentence, everything in moderation, which is very, very obvious to all of us. Probably thanks in part to Aristotle, because ultimately this is a big part of what he's saying, that, everything to excess is bad in both directions. So if you're drinking, being completely sober, unless you've had an issue with alcohol, is in itself unvirtuous, just as drinking to excess is unvirtuous. He's saying that finding a moderation allows you to experience the greatest eudaimonia possible, which is similar to, an Epicurean take. But similarly, courage and cowardice, too much courage is arguably just as bad as too much cowardice, and he would say find the mean between the two. And the mean changes. It's not just the absolute middle of the two. So if you place more value on courage than cowardice, naturally the mean would be closer towards courage than cowardice, but never absolutely at any extreme. But the trick and the skill is in finding the mean for all things. And I think this is extremely important, because I find myself, I become quite polarized. I always take a stance on something that's at one extreme, because it's very easy. It's a very good way of simplifying things, and that's what our brains try and do. Is we always are seeking to simplify things to lessen the load on ourselves. But really, if you want to try and do something as virtuously as possible, you should try and do it in moderation, and in a moderation that's appropriate for that given thing. So now what? We've talked about a bunch of shit that Aristotle has told us to do, things he's said, but ultimately I think the main problem for me, with this particular philosophy, but more generally philosophy as a whole, is, okay, now what? You've read the book, you've got these ideas, you understand them to be true, but what do you do about it? And I think this is a problem with all philosophy. Philosophers love talking, a lot of them don't like doing. Aristotle talks about himself that philosophy is meaningless unless you apply it, and he does mention ways in which this can be done. But in the modern day, you know, how do we take what we learn from the ethics of Aristotle and turn it into something that's actually useful, actually serves us and brings us either eudaimonia or whatever we seek personally. Because otherwise, what's the point? What is the point of philosophy if not to affect change? And so, for example, what will I do having read this book? I'm the person who's most likely to do anything about this. And I'll say some of the things we were talking about. The idea of having happiness as an ultimate end, that's impracticable. That's not something that I can do anything with. I can know it to be true, but you know, I don't. Apart from the fact that it's not something I fully agree with or accept, even if I did, what it's very theoretical. The idea that happiness is the ultimate end, because in day to day life, that I'm not thinking about that. That's not something that's on my mind, and it is therefore an impracticable fact of life. Another thing Aristotle talks about is how a man can be judged on the impact of his legacy. And this is an important concept to him, that what the knock-on effect of how you act in your virtuous or unvirtuous life are just as important as the things that happen while you're alive. And that's another example of something that is just entirely impracticable. That's not something I'll be able to do anything with, because I can't predict the future. All I can do is act virtuously now, and I should care that my actions aren't going to blow up a school in the future, after I'm dead. But equally, I can't possibly consider all the knock-on effects of how I've lived my life. So ultimately, I think that becomes impracticable beyond common sense. A lot of that is already common sense. Now, as I was saying earlier, we start to get into more practical philosophy when we consider what he was talking about with pleasure. You have to take pleasure in virtue, otherwise it's not sustainable. Now, that's something I can see a path to sustainability there, where or practicability there, where the sustainability of something is based on whether or not I find pleasure in it. And I think I completely agree that I wouldn't exercise, I wouldn't do these things that are good for me unless I did actually find pleasure. I didn't originally. When I first started working out and doing all these things, it was difficult, it was hard. But the only reason I'm still doing them is because I enjoy them. And I think ultimately you shouldn't be forcing yourself to do something that you don't enjoy, because otherwise you will come to resent that action of virtue. So I think that's something where you start seeing his philosophy being something that you can actually do day to day, and that's something that I will I'll take into account. Um, uh, and that comes to like how he was talking about um, the 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 average or um, the balance in all things. That's what I find. The main takeaway for me is that the most practicable thing he talks about is is the whole everything in moderation thing, where you treat everything and try and find the balance in it, as opposed to taking something to the extreme. Now, that's something I personally will take away and actually act upon decisively. Um, how will I do that? Again, as with all these things, it's a philosophy, and it can only exist in your head, and it needs to be on your mind for you to ever do anything about it. So what will I do? Well, I've talked about habits before. If I get into the habit of exercising moderation, then that will come naturally. If I eat nice food but don't overeat, all this sort of things. If I get into the habit of doing that, I think that's very useful in applying the philosophy and gaining something beneficial from the philosophy. Um, and then having it as a doctrine that you adhere to. So becoming a bit less pragmatic and being a bit more dogmatic about this, where you say, okay, well, you know, I'm going to do these things in moderation, or I'm going to do X and Y because it's something I believe in. that should only be the case if what you hold to believe is true in all cases, which is rare. But having a doctrine that you adhere to is another way of ensuring that the philosophy is practicable. Um, when I was writing this, I found it interesting as well to consider that, in a way, philosophy is kind of a bit, not useless, but it doesn't have that impetus to act. It's philosophers can talk all they want about, this philosophy isn't useful unless you act upon it. Philosophizing is not useful unless you act upon that which you're talking about, which is true. But saying it's true, it's almost like a catch-22. Saying it's true doesn't mean it's going to happen. That's the same with all philosophy. Saying something's true doesn't mean people are going to act upon it. And it's just it's still the fundamental problem you're encountering. And so the thing I was thinking that was interesting when I was writing this is religion is the solution to that. Religion is the okay. You need to do this. You need to do that, and you need to do this. Otherwise, bad things will happen. And that's a very effective way of ensuring your doctrine and your ideas and your worldview are are acted upon and contain practicable things. And I think that's why Christian ethics are so universal, because they not necessarily because they're right, because they're very good. They're very successful, but also because they're attached to this idea that requires you to act upon it in quite an effective way. So, in conclusion, Nicomachean Ethics by Aristotle has aged really badly. He said stuff like politics is a better and more honourable science than medicine. That's obviously wrong. No, I'm just joking. No, it's aged really well. It's aged very, very well. It's the basis of modern ethics. Nothing at all that he says is really out of line with what everyone in the world pretty much, or at least in the Western world, would consider to be common sense and just general ethics that we're instilled with from a young age. It's still useful, as impracticable as almost all of it is. As with all philosophy, it is still useful, because I've personally found things in it that I will take away and use in my everyday. It's so ingrained in the popular psyche potentially that we don't even realize what, because a lot of it I was reading and thinking, oh, this is obvious, but maybe it's obvious because it was so successful. It was so successful, and given that, reading the book is good because it's kind of a good way of coming back and understanding why we think the way we do, and I think that's quite useful in and of itself. And yeah, so to compress it all down, because again, to get back to the idea of philosophy needing to be practicable. The one problem with philosophy is there's a whole lot of words, and a lot of them are meaningful, and I agree with. But when I put the book down, I've forgotten 90% of it by the time I close the book, and 99% of it the next day. So if I'm going to try and distill the book into a single thing that you can try and take away from it that will be at all useful, it's that you should have everything in moderation. And I think that sort of sums up my experience with this book. Is that's something we already knew, everything in moderation. We already know that. But perhaps the utility of the book is understanding the reasons behind that, so that we can not just blindly adhere to such an assertion. And in terms of how to action that, ultimately, I think for me it comes down to remaining self-conscious, being aware of myself and how I'm acting, and being mindful in the actions that I take. Okay, that is the end of my talk. Any questions? That's the extra slide, by the way.
Is the
Yeah. Yes. It's a really good name. Mm. Yeah. Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. Well, exactly.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, that's what I sort of mean with like the habitual thing, habituating stuff. You need to kind of, it needs to be proactive until it becomes a habit. You need to be thinking
Mhm.
about it and like mindful all the time until it becomes just something you do every day. And that comes back to the idea of things need to be pleasurable. If you've made the habit of something, it makes it. If you're in the habit of drinking responsibly, it almost makes it pleasurable to do so. Like if you're people would you'd sort of feel a bit weird drinking to excess if you're well practiced at moderating yourself,
Yeah.
which allows it to be a sustainable virtue.
So I have a few questions. I've got three questions. Like like there's this sort of repetition of virtue as like the sort of way of finding, like as in like the execution of the mean, right? The sort of like average of what is good, right? But does Aristotle ever provide like a way of finding that mean, or is that something that is up to us to decide?
Yeah, I mean it is sort of up to you really because
Mm.
you know it's so it's so dependent on the situation, and to assign virtue, it's a relative thing, like
Mhm.
if you say that, and it's context dependent. If you say cooking this thing on the stove is virtuous, that isn't true necessarily because maybe you're cooking a you know I don't know.
Yeah,
It's
it's
entirely
something that
dependent
needs
on
to be
what
cooked on
you're
gas or something
doing
like that. No,
or
yeah. So is
you
it
know
you still have to trust your own pragmatic sense to be able to find, like it's more like if you can define two opposites, right? The mean would always be your own sort of reasonable preference for one of them, but never the thing in and of itself.
yes, yeah.
Who's who's jerking off, bro? I'm hearing clicks. Ah, that's Ian. Ah, okay. And
And this
yeah, no,
philosophy
okay.
got me. Next one.
Philosophy got him down bad, bro. Um, but yeah, so
Also,
and I've got yeah,
the book.
nice,
That's the book.
nice. So I've got
That one.
bruh, bruh. That's very nice. And I've got another question. It's like I guess it is in that same vein where like this idea that habits are something that are sustainable. But is there ever any allowance made for the distinction between strong and weak men? Or is virtue relative to what you can achieve always and all times?
That's a good question. I mean, personally, I'd obviously say that it's relative, but in terms of Aristotle's ethics, you know, there is like an absolute. I think he would say that there is an absolute um, idea, an external concept of virtue that you have to sort of um, abide by, and
Mhm.
whether that, you know, for example, he would probably, I would say, it it's not necessarily dependent on the person as to whether a given action is moral or not. It's sort of that's an absolute, and I think as a result, being ignorant, for example, I think he would say that irrespective of your upbringing, that's unvirtuous. Nowadays we'd say if someone's ignorant, that's because not necessarily their fault. It's because they haven't been exposed to the right education. They've been in a deprived situation or
So
whatever.
there's
But I
a
think
moral absolutes that kind
yes,
of are your responsibility to achieve, regardless of who you are.
yes, yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Well, that's a good answer. Yeah. Cool. That's it.
Is Ben? Are you here?
I am here, yes.
Cool. No, any questions?
Um, no, I've made some notes again for this. Not quite as many as I did for Ricardo's, but I've made some nevertheless. I don't have any particular questions, no.
Cool beans. Yeah. Well. Yeah. Yes. Yeah. But even beyond that, it's like it doesn't necessarily make it hard to be happier because theoretically we could invent a heroin machine where you get heroin constantly and it learns how to titrate up the heroin just so you're always in the like pleasurable zone for the rest of your life forever. That is the heroin machine proves that infinite happiness forever is possible. But like, is that something we want to do? Obviously not, because it doesn't
Yeah.
result in anything. And so resulting in something good is what I would see as the goal. Producing
It's
something worth
stupid though, isn't it?
The whole
I'll
infinite
explain why you
happiness,
think.
and it's just a big tube of heroin.
Yeah, you can cheat happiness. That's not
Yeah,
difficult.
exactly. No, but like that's kind of akin to the Rawls machine of experiences, right? Like, is it is even chasing like if you chase happiness as its ultimate goal, does that make any allowance for bad means to achieve that goal? Right? And that's exactly where you're trying to get at with the heroin example. Like, yeah, like if you define happiness as the ultimate end, why would taking heroin not be a great way to get there?
Yeah, it is the best way to get there.
Exactly. It's
Take a load of
instantaneous.
heroin, overdose. Because the thing is, as well, is it's like surely if happiness is the ultimate goal, and the longer the life you live, the more likely you are to encounter unhappiness and displeasure, then you should live as short a life as possible and live that life on as much heroin as possible. So the conclusion of utilitarian ethics
Yeah, it's
is to
literally
give
that.
every baby heroin until it dies.
Yeah. And with this, guys, we learned that
I
hedonism
know the
is
heroin
not.
example is supposed to be stupid, so that's fine. However, it is also stupid as an example.
Well, I want you to explain why.
Elaborate.
Well, but just because I suppose because the process happiness is a change from the norm. It's a break in the cycle. So like
When I said
in
when
order
I
for the
said the
heroin machine to work, you'd have to continuously inject increasing quantities up to an infinite amount of heroin every single
that's what
time
I
because
said.
you build. Okay, so yeah, I guess okay.
Permanently
I guess that's
titrating up the amount of heroin.
yeah. I mean,
And like I say as well, that doesn't work forever. So you could just end your life before it starts becoming displeasurable.
yeah,
Socratic,
I mean, right.
Socratic, speed running Socratic virtue. You
There's
know,
that proof
Socratic prudence is just like, yeah, I'm gonna hold this shit on for 3 seconds before I overdose. happen twice. Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Because
That's
you'll never
interesting.
have an exact amount of like if you flip it 1,000 times, the probability that you'll get 500 is not 50%. It's a lot less than that because there's variation in the actual events themselves. So you'd need
Statistics is
yeah,
fucked up.
yeah. Speed run your heroin happiness. Yeah, cool. Yeah, no, of course, but but that's the thing. It's like you can't really define happiness in that way because you're operating with a very narrow external definition, isn't it? Like,
Well, that's why I
you,
like the idea of being Felix,
yeah, a
because
holistic
it's
kind of view of the thing.
combination of luck and happiness and is well-being basically. And
Yeah,
we wouldn't say
exactly.
well-being is equivalent to happiness.
No, but it is certainly like one of those fundamental necessary. It's not a sufficient condition to be happy, but it is a necessary. Yeah, exactly. It's like happiness is a set of necessary and sufficient conditions, right? So you can never really distill it to any one thing that produces it momentarily, right? It's a combination of all these well individual parts that make this whole that is happiness, and to define happiness as a single thing, as a single objective with no moving parts within it, is the thing that inevitably leads to these ridiculous examples being used to refute happiness in and of itself. They are happiness is a consequence of many other interlocking parts that constitute a complete life, and
Yeah.
it's trying to capture that deep essence of happiness is fundamentally like the critical aspect. And that's why I
Well,
think
I
that
think it's quite an interesting. Sorry, you go.
just to wrap up, like, and that's why I think that, for example, this idea of doing things in moderation is so powerful as a path to eudom. What's it called? Like eudomia? No, fuck,
Eudaimonia.
eudaimonia. There you go. There is such a powerful path for eudaimonia because it allows you to explore many avenues to achieve that whilst never really going over anything, and it allows you to have a whole life of many different things and experience many different things and really become complete and multidimensional as a human being whilst never really pushing you over the edge in any particular direction.
Yeah. Yeah. Because eudaimonia translates literally. I just looked it up. I thought it could be literally translated as well-being, and it basically can. It means good
Mhm.
spirit.
Yeah.
Um, as opposed to euphoria, which I think, uh, as with every Greek word, there's not a literal translation, but
Mhm.
I think euphoria might not even be Greek. Uh, anyway, euphoria is in my
Yeah,
mind is
the
dopamine.
peak. Yeah, exactly.
Eudaimonia is felicitas
Yeah,
and
exactly.
well-being. And I
If
think Aristotle,
eudaimonia is like a generalized form of happiness, then euphoria is like a single focused, like distilled point of like extreme happiness. It's literally
yeah.
going over the edge in this very narrow way.
But even then, I would say euphoria isn't necessarily an excess. Like, you know, um, eating eating a tasty warm soup is a euphoric experience, but that's not necessarily a
Okay.
non-virtuous thing. That's just a nice
Hmm.
experience. That's still euphoria.
Hmm.
Um,
Okay.
but eudaimonia and happiness, as defined by Aristotle, is a very very broad thing. It's
Hmm.
essentially well-being and as a result of virtue, and it's very broad as opposed to what we would call happiness, because our sort of modern tendency is to boil happiness down to this very simple thing of pleasure chemicals and you know defining it in very simple terms. I think the definition of happiness in Aristotle is very broad and rather more complex, and that sort of lends itself quite well to his philosophy because you know to define to define happiness as the ultimate end in the modern day is easily played off as hedonism, but his definition of happiness would necessarily involve the building of a family unit, the acquiring of the food that's necessary to live, but not necessary to become
morbidly obese.
Yeah, exactly.
Um,
So it's a different happiness, and it's it's not necessarily straight hedonism, but I still think that it's interesting to consider that it's almost a combination of what I would say is the ultimate end, which is doing the right things and achieving the right things, and also being happy and doing the things that make you feel good. It's a combination of the two.
Yeah.
Existing in a state of euphoria and in a state of achievement, I suppose.
Yeah, euphoria, but with the Tao.
Yeah,
I don't like when we try and define happiness. I think it's not a very good way to do things. Because you can argue yourself in circles doing this all day about what is true happiness and what is just egotism. And I've done this before, and it doesn't get. I don't know. It just doesn't work for me. It doesn't get me anywhere. I'm very happy with my own definition of it.
Yeah, of course. But like, we're trying to contextualize this in this sort of framing of Aristotle, right? We're trying to explore his ideas. We're not necessarily articulating our
that's fair.
ourselves in this. At least that's how I'm looking at this anyway. Maybe people have different views.
Ben, would you say that happiness, according to your definition, like whatever you think happiness is, whether that's pleasure chemicals or whether it's starting a family, whatever that is to you, would you say that's your goal, or would you say that your goal transcends that?
I think it depends on the definition of happiness, obviously. I don't think that I tend to define happiness when I can avoid it. But we're not going to get into this because we'll go down the road that we went down last time, which was a huge argument. So, but I don't like to define it. I have what I need to do, and I do it, and I live
That's why I'm not.
the life
That's
I
why
know
I'm
I
not
need
asking.
to live.
I'm just saying that, like, I know what happiness is to me, kind of, but like I still haven't fully figured it out. But I just know that even if I were to figure it out, it's not necessarily the be all and end all for me. It's a part of a puzzle that is what my ultimate goal is. So I'm just saying, for you,
I see what you mean. Yeah.
Part of the puzzle?
Ultimately, this is a road to discovering ourselves, right? Like, we
I
will die and not know who. No, it's not even that.
Is satisfaction and happiness, are they the same thing? Some people would define satisfaction as happiness. Some people would say no, those are
won't. Yeah.
things.
That's a good word. That is a good word.
Yeah.
And I think
I
in
ain't got no
Aristotle's
satisfaction.
definition of happiness,
Rolling Stones solved this a long time ago. Sorry, I don't mean to.
but I think in Aristotle's definition of happiness, satisfaction is like falls under that umbrella.
I just realized what you said then. Rolling Stones have solved this a long time ago.
Yeah, they did. They wrote a 4-bar song.
Rolling Stones, I can't get no
satisfaction. When they came back in black. Maybe coming back.
Oh no, man.